Hey everybody, welcome to the Learn to Read Egyptian Hieroglyphs class, or as they said in ancient Egyptian, Imhotep. My name is Fadi, and I'm going to be your guide in this journey as we take a look into the mysterious language known as the hieroglyphs. We're going to look at a little bit about the history behind it, how long it's been around, what it was used for, and just kind of see where it came and how it evolved. Now, one thing I want you to understand, this is not a comprehensive look at the grammar or the syntax of every single solitary thing about the hieroglyphs. It's simply an overview, and my hope for you is that at the end of this, when we look at an actual Egyptian inscription, that you're able to look at it and see some things that you weren't able to see before. So let's get into it. All right, some information about the actual hieroglyphs. One thing of note is the Egyptian hieroglyphs has the longest recorded history of any written language, dating back about 4,000 years. That's not to say it's the oldest written language. I actually misspoke earlier in a discussion I was having with somebody. Cuneiform actually does predate it by about 400 years. As a matter of fact, a little bit of some Egyptian language or Egyptian written language actually has some forms of cuneiform in it, but it has been around for a long time and was actually around for a lot longer than the cuneiform was. As a matter of fact, it lasted from about 3000 BC to about 4 AD, almost like I said, 4,000 years. Another thing of note really to understand about hieroglyphs is it's not a pictorial language. Just because you see the picture of a bird or the picture of a person or the picture of whatever does not mean that it's talking about that specific thing. Because I have a bird doesn't mean I have a bird. Because I have an owl does not mean I have an owl. As a matter of fact, most of the symbols that were used actually created sounds, much like our English language does. The letter M, for example, creates the M sound. The letter S creates the S sound. It's the same thing in the Egyptian language, and a lot of them have letters that we actually don't have in the English language, and we'll get into those in a little bit. So there on the screen you'll see that we have here are some basics ideas here. The first one is the W sound, or the U. You can see that's a quail chick. That's actually what that little picture is. The next one is it's a gate, but it actually has the purr sound. And then the last one is the Sau sound. And we'll talk a little bit about where these sounds come from. A lot of them are based off of the region. To me, I used to be an Arabic linguist, and they actually remind me a lot of Arabic pronunciations. Though, I must say, we do not know, and when I say we, the Egyptologists do not know exactly how the language sounded. They're basing it off educated guesses and also other languages that were actually around during the time frame of the Egyptian language. So, if we don't really know how it sounded, how do we have an idea or even an educated guess on how it sounded? So Egyptologists kind of did a lot of research, and for a long time they didn't know kind of squat until they actually kind of looked at languages that were around during the time frame at the end of the use of the Egyptian language. One of those languages was Coptic. Coptic is actually still used at the Coptic Church nowadays, though obviously not used nearly as much. So it did exist. We actually have texts that date from the 14th century that were in Coptic. So it was used around the same time frame. Some differences are the Coptic uses the actual Greek alphabet, so there's a great deal of Greek influence in there. One thing I've actually read a couple different things of, some scholars believe that Coptic is actually the evolved form of ancient Egyptian. Whether that's true or not, I'll leave it to the really smart people. I'm not one of them. But there are very, very many similarities between the two languages. So, in order to kind of understand the language, Egyptologists, after centuries of not really knowing, they started applying Coptic principles to the language, and suddenly what they were reading and what they were trying to translate started to make sense. So using Coptic gave them the ability to actually begin to translate and come up with what we understand about hieroglyphs today. So now let's start looking at the actual hieroglyphs that we can actually understand. Before your list of a couple of the common ones, these ones are known as the one sound signs. Each hieroglyph itself presents one sound. For example, the top one, 2 reeds or 2 slashes or strokes, presents the Y sound. The quail chick, as we've shown earlier, is the W sound. If you look on the right, you have the mouth, which is the R sound, or the dish, which is the K sound. The folded cloth is the S sound. So these are sounds that are actually fairly common within the English language and are easily for us to translate or to at least understand. Now, as we go along, we're going to get into more complex sounds, compound sounds, then also sounds that are actually not in the English language. And here you have it, 3 letters or hieroglyphs that actually have sounds that aren't just one sound. For example, the lake, or looks like kind of a box, is the sh sound from ship. You have the animal leash, which is the ch sound from church. And then you have the snake, which is the j sound, similar to jail. So you can see just from these symbols, they're not exactly what we would use for one letter. In the English language, we use for 2, but in this case, they're actually 1 letter. Now, there are some other more complex ones, letters that don't exist in the English language. For example, the ka, the ain, the alif, and some other letters that, like I said, don't really exist in the English language. They do exist in other languages common to the region, such as Arabic, or at least that's what Egyptologists believe. So as we go, we're going to use a little bit of those sounds, and hopefully you can kind of get an understanding for it, but also understand that we don't really know what it exactly sounded like. These are all educated guesses. So instead of sitting here going over, looking at pictures and pictures and pictures of this and that and trying to come out with sounds, why don't we go ahead and move on to an actual stela, which is a carving or an inscription that was found within the tomb of someone. So here we have an actual carving or a stela from the tomb of Mereri. We'll get into how we know it's Mereri's carving here in a minute. This one actually dates back to the 9th or 11th dynasty, somewhere around 2160 to 2040 BC. So it's kind of old. It was collected in a region called Dendera in Upper Egypt. Something a little tidbit of information. Upper Egypt is actually southern Egypt, and Lower Egypt, which you might hear at times, is actually northern Egypt. The reason this is, and a reason it's kind of counterintuitive, is we in the modern sensibilities are used to using cardinal positioning for things, north, south, east, and west. Well, they didn't have that back then, or at least hadn't really discovered so much of that. So they used topography. The Nile itself was their lifeblood, so the lower part of Egypt, or what they called Upper Egypt, actually had the mountains and stuff, and it's also the direction that the flow of the Nile came from, so it flows from south to north. So it made sense that they would call that Upper Egypt. It was higher in topology, whereas everything in northern Egypt was lower in topology, therefore it was Lower Egypt. So William Petrie is the one that found this, also along with Matthew Flanders. They were professors. They found it sometime. Obviously, you can see there for yourself. And this is actually still located in the National Museum of Scotland. So what we're going to actually do in this is we're going to break apart this actual hieroglyphic carving, and you, by the time you walk out of this class, I hope, are able at least to look at this and go, oh, I can tell someone about this, this, and this, and now I'm kind of seem educated. Or you at least have a little bit of information on how Egyptian hieroglyphs were read. So as we begin to look at this, one of the things we need to really keep in mind is Egyptian hieroglyphs were actually drawn or carved or what have you by artists. Artists tend to take artistic liberties at times. Also, they were limited on the medium they were using, so they kind of, even though there are rules that they actually follow most of the time, they break those rules simply because of space or other reasons. So they might not follow the rules exactly. So even though I might tell you, here, this is the rule, it's not always the way it is. The first thing you want to do when you're looking at any type of Egyptian hieroglyph is you want to look at the big picture. What is this big picture telling me? What are the commonalities that I can see? The first one when you look is the huge man on the left-hand side. If you look, he has, he has a scepter in one hand and a staff in one hand, and he's got really nice necklace on there, and his hair is in that traditional Egyptian-looking manner. So that tells us right away this guy was probably someone important, probably a leader of some sort, but we don't know exactly until we get into this. There's something else that this is actually telling us. If you notice the man and all the animals in this picture, and all the pseudo-animals or the animal type things or the seated figures, they're all facing to the right. That tells us a lot of things right off the bat. The biggest thing it tells us is which way to read this. So you read this as if you were facing that person. So for example, he is facing to the right, so I will start on the right and move to my left. It's that simple. You should always be this way. Once again, I don't know if there's any artistic expressions out there that they didn't do that, but in this case, and for the most part, you should read facing the person, right to left in this case. Now the typical sentence structure is verb, subject, noun, object. It's very similar to many Middle Eastern languages. Once again, though, I am going to caveat it right up front. That's not guaranteed, and actually when we get into this, you're going to see they break that rule right at the beginning. But that's okay. We're going to get through this, and you're going to be able to read this by the time we're done, or at least have a really good understanding. So now we got a little bit of information to work with. Let's start breaking this stela down. We're going to begin here on the right, like we said. Also, we read top to bottom, always top to bottom. Looking at the area highlighted in red, that's where we're going to start. You're going to see this little curved little plant, and that is actually where we right away begin to break the rules. If you notice, I had said before that we go verb, subject, noun, object. In this case, we're actually not going to start with the verb. We're actually going to start with a noun. The reason is here, as you can see here on your screen, we're looking at the word for king. And that first letter, or first hieroglyph, is actually an abbreviation. So we're starting off with a noun. And the reason we're starting with the noun is because the word king takes precedence. It is the honored position. Therefore, we're going to put it first. But also, this is, like I said earlier, this is an actual abbreviation, and this is where the artists' ability to kind of modify things due to space limitations or just artistic expression comes into play. Now, the word for king, if you look over here on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the little plant along with the loaf and the squiggly line, which is water, and then a seated person, or that's actually the seated person that actually designates king, is actually Nesau. So even though we don't see all the symbols here, we know due to the context and actually how these were created over thousands of different inscriptions we've looked at, that this word is used commonly as an abbreviation for the word king. So even though it doesn't spell out Nesau, we will say Nesau. Now the next set of hieroglyphs is another example that will show you how they use abbreviations to cover one specific word. So if you look at this, you'll see you have the kind of the little loaf upside down or upside down dish, and then you have like a board with a knot on it. If you look over on what I have next to that line, you'll see there are other symbols that kind of associate with that. Once again, this is artistic expression, and due to limited space, anytime you see these combination of two characters or two hieroglyphs, it actually uses the word for offering, or heta. So one thing I will mention as well, and this is just a commonality and does have exceptions, like always. You notice I'm pronouncing things and I'm saying like hetep or neso or whatever. I'm putting a letter between things, so the Egyptians do not write their vowels. They didn't put them into their carvings. So we assume without other reasons to change it, that we put the eh sound between things. So it's just what they do. That's what Egyptologists do. There are times they don't do that, and that's because they have other words that come from either other languages or that have been assimilated by the Greeks or the Romans or etc. that gave them different pronunciations. And we'll actually get into one of those here very shortly. So in this case, so far, we have the first word for king and the second word for offering. Now the third word is di, or di. This is the word for gives. So if you look at this total sentence structure of this first sentence we're looking at tells us king, offering, gives. That is not the sentence structure that I talked about, right? So the reason is, once again, the king gets the honor position. He is in the beginning. So the king is giving an offering, excuse me. The king is giving an offering. With the king giving an offering, it's kind of important to understand exactly who he would be giving an offering to. And this next collection of hieroglyphs tells us exactly who that is. And in this case, it's to the god Osiris. Now the weird thing about this, and let's break this word down that we have here. You have an eye, a set of stairs, then you have a seated figure with the typical Egyptian beard that you see sometimes. Those actually break out to be specific meanings. The eye is a sound complement that actually is the sound of ear, I-R, ear. The stairs is the sound complement or the combined sound of us, aleph, sa. So the third symbol is actually what we call a determinative. And what that means is it tells me that the words or the hieroglyphs prior to this mean something. And what that means is this seated figure who has that beard, this is known as the god of Osiris, so this must be, the two hieroglyphs must be his name, Asir. Yes, it's pronounced Asir, not Ir-As, it's Asir. The funny thing about this as well is that is not how we pronounce it. As I said earlier, this is the god Osiris. So why am I saying Osiris? This goes back to when we had wonderful invaders who would go into northern Africa, lower Egypt, and they would invade and they would take over and they would force a lot of their culture onto them. So Asir was hard for them to say, so they began saying Osiris, and that's kind of what stuck throughout the ages. Now we're going to move on to the next column, which is moving to the left, starting at the top. And you'll see that first hieroglyph we're looking at kind of looks like a bowl. That bowl is a compound syllable or a compound sound. It actually is the word neb. Neb is used in context of hieroglyphs for the word Lord. As we go, we're going to kind of see what this whole group of hieroglyphs means, and it's actually fairly significant as well. The next couple symbols, or hieroglyphs, you have four of them. You have this kind of pillar-looking thing with a hand and a bird, and then a circle with like a plus sign inside of it. These group of symbols actually, once again, mean something. They denote sounds, but they also denote other things. So the first one, the pillar with the lines in it, is actually the sound j. So just like we kind of talked about jail, but you want to put a D in front of it as well. So it's j, j. The next one is the hand. That is the letter D. D. So jed. So we have j and d. Jed. Jed. And then the last one is the quail chick. We've seen that before. It is the oo sound, the W sound. Now, the last one, if you look in there, is the circle with the plus sign. That is very similar to what we saw previously with Osiris, where we had a seated person. That circle is known as a determinative. Once again, so determinative tells me something about the previous symbols. The previous symbols were a word, jedu, And what that circle with the plus sign tells me, it tells me it's an actual location. So this is the location known as Jadu. So this whole context of this red highlighted area is Lord of Jadu. The significance of that phrase, Lord of Jadu, goes right back to the previous hieroglyphs we're looking at of Osiris. So this is a common title given to Osiris, Lord of Jadu. As we move down, looking at the yellow highlighted area, this actually is going to go back to a little more what we were talking about in the previous column. So far we know that the king is giving an offerus to Osiris, Lord of Jadu. This next section is actually taken once again, seen many times in inscriptions, as a type of offering. And what we're looking at here, you'll see you have the box over top of a pot and two other pots. And if you look underneath of that, you see a small circular horizontal line. So that is known as the paratharu. We could break down each individual letter if we want to go and actually look at it. But these are a group that come together very commonly. Paratharu means voice offering. Now we have the king giving an offering to Osiris, Lord of Jadu, a voice offering. So he's giving a voice offering. So it's kind of combining with the first one. And then this last little squiggly line on the bottom of water, the squiggly line on the bottom, is the letter N, but it's also used for the transitionary word for. So the king is gives a offering to Osiris, Lord of Jadu, a voice offering for someone. And that's where we're going to get into to see exactly who the king is giving an offering to Osiris for. As we move on to the next column, we start at the top, looking down, and we see an anamorphic lion head. And then underneath of that, we see a bent forearm. Now those two hieroglyphs together make the word governor. So breaking them apart a little bit, the anamorphic lion head is actually a 3-syllable sounding letter. It is the ha, the aleph, and the ta. So that will be het. But combine it together with the forearm. And the forearm is actually the ayin. So that would be heta, heta. So as we go and look through there, and so now we know he's a governor, we're moving on to the next section. Bear in mind, as we go down, we're reading right to left. So we're going to read the bird first, then the mouth. Yes, that's a mouth, not an eye. So, and then below that is the kind of bent stick with like a paddle, the kind of what it looks like. So the owl is the letter M, and the mouth is the letter R. Mur, mur. Those two hieroglyphs together make the word overseer. The next one down is a little weird because we're going to break the rules again. If I were to read that right to left, the bent stick looking one is actually the word necher. 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 The one next to it is hem. However, that's not how it's written. Or excuse me, that is how it's written, but that's not how it's pronounced. So we will not say necher hem. We're going to say hem necher. The reason for this is the bent stick, for example, the word for priests, necher, is considered an honorary word. Therefore, it will come first, even though you say it second. So we have mur ham necher, even though that's not exactly how it's written. So he is the overseer of priests. Going down to the light blue section, we have a little seated figure. That seated figure is another 3-letter syllable sounding word. It is the sa'u, sa'u. So it's sa, aleph, wu. That word is the word for guardian. Now, traditionally, you're not just a guardian, you're a guardian of something. And that's where we're going to look at this next huge amount of hieroglyphs that are kind of together. The thing about those, the 4 hieroglyphs at the top of the green section, it's a loop with a squiggly line and 2 upside down semicircles. So the loop is the letter to the sound of church, so church, just like before. The squiggly line is the word N, it's the letter N. It actually means water, but we're just getting sounds from it right now. So we have cha, na, and then we have 2 loaves. Those loaves are the letter T. So those 4 symbols together make up the word temple. Sounding together, you would look at it, going off what I kind of said earlier, where you put kind of letter sounds between letters. This should be chenetet. That's not how they actually, scholars actually pronounce this. When you have 2 of the same symbols next to each other, they say one is complementary, kind of like the way we do it when we say like Google or cattle or something where we have 2 letters. We only say it one time. So in this case, it's chenet, the word for temple. The 4 symbols on the bottom, where you see one that looks kind of like a cow or a yak with antlers or a steer or something, and then 3 vertical dashes, those denote something specific about the quote-unquote temple. Even though we said earlier that the Egyptian language, the ancient Egyptian language hieroglyphs, is not a pictorial language, that's not to say they can't use it like a pictorial language. And in this case, they actually do. So this actually is a picture that is actually denoting the word for cattle. So he is the guardian of the temple cattle. Without any other context, how many cattle is he actually talking about? So that's what those vertical dashes actually tell us. They tell us that it's plural. So he's the guardian of the temple cattle. Many of them, not just one. So this whole column gives us a lot of information about who this person is, and in the next huge column, we're actually going to find out who he is. So we've come to the last column, where this big guy is standing. He's got a scepter in one hand and a staff in the other, and he's got this big ornate necklace and some really awesome looking hair, and he's got this skirt on, and he's just toting like he is just the king of the hill. So the section highlighted in red is actually his name. So the first letter, that kind of sidewise A, is a 2-syllable letter, mer, M-R, mer. Now you might be looking at my slides and saying, hey, look at that there, you have 2 together and you say them twice, and there's actually a reason for this, because we actually use the letter R 3 times. The first one is where that first symbol, mer, M-R. Then we have the mouth, which is another R, right? Then we have another mouth, which is another R, and then we have the reed leaf. The reed leaf is the letter Y. So, if we go through our rules as before, MR from the first letter, with an R after it, that R is complementary, therefore we do not pronounce it. The next R, however, we do pronounce because it is considered by itself. It is a third R. And then Y. So, this person's name is Mereri. So now that we looked over the entire stela, we can kind of take what we broke apart and figured out and turn it into an actual translation. Now, the one thing to understand about translations is you really want to put them into as close to proper syntax or sentence structure as you can to help you understand what they're trying to say. Translation is an art form, and it's a skill that you learn over time. It's really hard to do sometimes. That's why things like Google Translate are not the best places to start unless you really understand how to break things apart. So I've seen many translators take things and just translate them literally, And when you read the sentence back in English or in whatever language you're translating it to, it kind of doesn't really sound right. You can get the idea, but just like, wow, that's just really bad. So anytime you try to translate something, try to put it into like proper English in this case. So we're going to go through and look at this, and it says, the king gives an offering to Osiris, Lord of Jeddu, for the governor, the overseer of priests, the guardian of the temple cattle, Mereri. So now we know from this stela what tomb this was in. We can actually see that this was given for the purpose of Mereri. So there we go. We looked at the history of the hieroglyphs. We even opened up the tombs of the pharaohs themselves. We took a look at one of the stelas, the stela from the tomb of Mereri. We were able to break it down and translate it and actually kind of read what it was trying to tell us. So what's next? Well, I hope for all of us, this inspired us to want to learn more, because there's so much more out there that there is to learn. I'm Fatty, and I want to thank you for joining me on this journey as we go through and learned how to read the hieroglyphs. Imhotep.